Welcome everyone to Ethics in Digital Assets and Infrastructure. We are joined today by speakers Natasha Blycha, Rupert Colchester, Ellie, Rennie and Keay. Please take the stage, Natasha, the moderator of today's panel.
Thanks so much. Now, can I just ask for your grace and tolerance if my internet is not great? The reason being my poor mummy has fallen and broken 6 ribs, so I've just rushed up to her house. So I'm not sure if I've got the best internet or not. I've got no idea how their internet is. So if it's not great, someone let me know, and I'll talk less and I'll ask more questions. So today we are talking about ethics, and we have with us Dr. Keay, we have Ellie, Rennie from RMIT, and we have the wonderful Rupert Colchester from IBM. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them to tell a little bit about their backstory of how we've got to where we've got to today, and why, how they're interested in blockchain and how that intersects with ethics, and their backstory that has led to those two intersections. Dr. Sue, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks very much, Natasha. I'm the CEO of the Queensland Artificial Intelligence Hub and also the chair of Robotics Australia. And I guess the reason why blockchain is important in these areas is often around how we use sensing data. So sensing is very important to be able to get robots to operate, and one of the most important things to consider is whether the data that's being collected from the sensors and then controlling decision making is actually accurate and reproducible, and how you can ensure that it's safely stored, which is where blockchain is increasingly being used. And then, I think that raises the question of how do we do that assurance, and, what are the ethics that we need to apply to make sure that we can trace back and have accountable decision making that guides the actions of these things, which will be increasingly taking more action in the physical world in which we are operating. So that's the perspective that I'm bringing to today's panel.
And Ellie, can you do the same for us as well?
Sure. So I am a professor at RMIT University and a future fellow. So I'm doing a 5-year project, which is looking at cooperation through blockchain infrastructures. So my interest in ethics is, I suppose, what the new capabilities we have, what arises as a result of having different types of infrastructures, digital infrastructures. I'm part of the Blockchain Innovation Hub at RMIT, and some of the work I've been doing has been with the humanitarian sector.
Now I'll just keep my image off to see if that helps. Rupert, tell us a little bit about your background and how you end up on an ethics panel.
Good question. It's very strange now talking to you, Natasha, with no face on the screen whatsoever. But so 20 years ago, I did AI at university and got really quite into the whole ethics of AI. That's a topic that's come on leaps and bounds since then. But of course, some of the kind of core principles are still there. And I suppose I took that personal interest area into blockchain as a kind of technology and a whole space and domain when I started leading blockchain for IBM in the UK 3-4 years ago, 2017. I did that for a year, and since then I've come to Australia. I'm now a partner at IBM. I don't run the blockchain team anymore as of a few months ago, but it's still very much a real subject matter expertise for me. And so, it's definitely interested in how we as a kind of big blue corporate business engage with our clients to help them use new technology, but then use new technology in a really ethical, sustainable, sensible way, which is of course always absolutely fundamental to what any kind of enterprise is trying to do with these sorts of new innovations.
So, okay, let's pick you up on that word fundamental then, Rupert. So, I mean, this is an ethics panel, so you might say it's a philosophical panel, but I would suggest it's really quite a practical and deeply important panel. And if you to sort of go down the philosophical track, you would say, well, what on earth is ethics, because people will bring different interpretations to even hearing those words. And you can say very clever things like, well, oh God, it's a mix of deontological rules, or is it consequentialism, people sort of deciding if the consequences of what they do are good or bad. These are pretty substantive questions. So when we look at the world, and we all have discussed this in other panels over the course of Blockchain Week, and we say, okay, what we're effectively doing is we are manifesting the current world that we live at into a digital twin. I think Wired wrote an article about Mirror World. Some of you might have read that a few years back. So if we are doing that and we're saying, okay, we are going to take ethics into the digital realm, what does that actually practically mean? Is it a question about design, or is it a question that we don't even know ourselves in order to take those ethics into the digital world, into blockchain? Sue, what do you think? Is this even a ludicrous thing to even try? We're already a corrupt and terrible and wonderful people. Can we even make a digital realm ethical?
Yeah, I think we can, and I think that is actually an area of arguably competitive advantage for a country like Australia, particularly with our position in the Asia Pacific. So, I think with all technologies, there's the potential for them to be used either for good or bad, and I think that we're in a great position to actually market a lot of the different technology that we produce based on the ethics that we use in producing it. Because I think if we are producing technology that is consistent with our values as a nation, I think what we will find is that there will be a lot of other countries that would be quite keen to be able to access technology that is consistent with our values, as opposed to consistent with the values of maybe some of their nearest neighbours. So we know that different countries have quite different attitudes towards things like surveillance of their population, and Australia probably is one of the countries that upholds those values, and there'd be quite a lot strong backlash if we were to embed ethics in any of our technologies that go against the values that we have as a society. So I think, obviously it's quite technically difficult to make sure that those ethics are embedded, but, the proof's always in the pudding. And so when we actually do go and use these technologies, people very quickly will discover whether they operate in good ways or bad. Sadly, there are some technologies that probably are less visible that we would have to keep our eye on. But I actually think this is an area that if we were to, find ways that people feel comfortable in developing technologies that adhere to a particular set of rules, then that's actually something that we can use to promote the technology that we develop here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I'm with you. I think technology is neutral. It can be used. It can use for just the same as we can. It can be used for harm. It can be used for good. But I'm interested, Rupert, in you've spoken about sort of designing with ethics in mind. Practically speaking, when you design a platform, what does that mean? Is that a bit of marketing jargon, or what practically do you do to design an ethical product? Is it a new algorithm? Is it saying you're going to deal with privacy? Is it data collection? What is it?
It's certainly all of those things, but I think it's quite a few things around the outside. I mean, generally speaking, when you're starting off on the journey, you're probably more likely to be avoiding the traps, the unethical traps, than you are proactively thinking about the ethical things, right? It's the same to your sort of question. To me, technology has to slot into an ethical world, the world of ethics and what's good, what's bad, that evolves, but it's there already. These new things that come along, they need to just slot in, sometimes to the kind of legal framework that the country is operating or whatever. Sometimes it's to regulatory things. Sometimes it's to a company's values and principles. I mean, sometimes, for example, I'll work with a client and they'll say that this particular solution that we want built to track, the traceability of food through their supply chain, it's got to actually meet their company values. That may even trump core ethics. So it kind of goes higher than just ethics, I guess, is one comment. And yes, it is a design thing, but probably more by virtue of avoiding those pitfalls. So how do you make sure that data sharing is done in a way that is ethical? How do you not share one person's private data with someone else? That's the absolute classic one. Of course, that's quite mature now, that topic. And I think I've found blockchain as a tech very interesting, because it's, on the one hand, it's seen as a bit of a dangerous technology around the whole ethics. On the other hand, it's a real enabler. It can do some really clever things. It could, in principle, we could get rid of fake news if we actually managed to track the source of news properly, for example.
And I like that.
So there's definitely some good things it can do, and there are some dangerous areas, pitfalls, I suppose, of the tech in itself when people are designing blockchain solutions, whatever that may be for.
So let's Ellie, I'll get you to come in here. So, okay, so we've come to a conclusion that technology is basically neutral, but at the same time, we can probably design technology to be more ethical. A blockchain is not a blockchain, is not a blockchain. Would you say that blockchain has some peculiar functions that make it slightly less ethical or more ethical? Or have you got any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure that I really like thinking about it in terms of ethics, to be honest. I find when we start having debates around ethics of AI or new technologies or whatever it might be, we end up with guidelines that are actually pretty hard to enforce and become very political very quickly, and can even descend into culture wars. So for me, I find having to think about this in terms of ethics frustrating. There has been, of course, fantastic work done by the Human Rights Commissioner around what kinds of principles we need to be thinking about in relation to the development of new technologies. So I don't want to ignore that or undermine it in any way. But for me, what's interesting about blockchain, and I think it comes back to that wonderful Blockstack slogan, which was "can't be evil" instead of "don't be evil," which I think we're all very familiar with. And of course, it was very early on and perhaps a bit overstated at the time, because you can be evil with a blockchain. But what we have is, through the distributed design, is we have the ability, I suppose we can think of it as an enabling technology. It can enable different ways of doing things. And for me, what it really comes back to then is the governance of blockchain applications. So who is running them? What are the intentions of those groups, those companies, those communities? And what types of governance are going to produce good social outcomes? It can also be in the design. And I think there are some fantastic examples, like Gitcoin grants, where people are really thinking hard about new ways to fund public goods. And I think even things like the Pull Together No Loss Lottery are new possibilities for how to produce different fundraising for nonprofits and the like. But in the end, for me, it's not so much about ethics, but about outcomes and who is able to create those outcomes, and how those groups organize themselves to do that in a way that we can't on centralized corporate infrastructures.
Okay, well, I might pick up on that last point. There's something that you said, and it really made me start to think about funding of these different models. And of course, you go all the way to the cypherpunk version, which is something that really libertarian idea post-financial crisis. You come up with a big public permissionless blockchain, don't really have governance per se, and then you end up sort of at the next end of the spectrum, which is a slightly more pragmatic enterprise version, which is quite permissioned, and you've got lots of enterprise level people with GDPR commitments and other directors' duties that they need to follow. How do we then ensure that we get you would have all read Shoshana Zuboff's book or come across her Surveillance Capitalism book. If we want to do no harm, and we have models now where there are people in governance who are making decisions about the designs of these technologies, how do we do that when we know that Google started with intentions of saying do no harm, but actually business models and venture capital models, for example, don't necessarily I'm put off a little bit by using the word ethics, Ellie, because I've bought into your. I'm persuaded by your piece on saying we shouldn't just be ethical. But let's just say, how do we be good for a second? How do we do that if the way of funding these technologies doesn't necessarily end in outcomes that have the best results for humanity? They don't necessarily bring diverse teams into the room, and they may end up with these sort of data collections that aren't in everybody's interest. How do we do that? Back to you, Ellie.
Okay. I think that I actually found Keay Warwick's conversation yesterday really fascinating and interesting, where he was talking about running these 3 different DAOs, or not running them because he is no longer the benevolent dictator, but these are running themselves. And of course, synthetics isn't necessarily an ethical infrastructure. It's just something that you use for trading, as wonderful as it is. But they're having to define their own terms and what it means to build something in a way which fulfills the interests of that group. So I think we kind of need to start with that. And we do have concepts in the corporate world, like social license to operate, which comes out of the resources sector, around which are asking, well, what is it that makes companies go beyond compliance? What is it that makes them do better and try to fulfill some kind of social purpose? And I think with blockchain, that is very much defined by each community. I'm doing some work with some international scholars. There's a big network of us where we're starting to look at what legitimacy is in blockchain applications, and very much how each community defines that according to their own rules and I suppose in some ways a culture and norms within those groups.
That legitimacy is starting to sound very much like ethical behavior. Well, God, I don't even know what it is. They all start, are you good or are you bad? I don't know.
Yes, but what I would say is that some of those groups are going to be for-purpose organizations. So if, the Amanda Robinson speaking in the next session, so I won't take her space, but, the work that the Trust Alliance is doing, which I've been involved with around digital identity, which is very much based on humanity first principles, is really interesting. And so blockchain is enabling parts of our society, which I think have been somewhat marginalized in terms of digital infrastructures, to step forward and start creating their own rules. So as that occurs more and more, I think we will start to see better systems arise, and hopefully others will have to fall in suit. We'll have to follow it.
What do you think, Sue? Do you think that blockchain, and your expertise is in robotics as well. Is there some segue between, talking about ethics in blockchain and talking about ethical design in what you've come across in your robotics career?
Oh, well, I guess I agree with Ellie in that, there's no shortage of ethical frameworks for things like AI, developed by, every country. And yet, for people who are developing the technology, much as everyone aspires to have that as part of the design process, often it's really not clear how those frameworks can help the technologists. So I think often the people creating the technology can feel a little bit out on a limb trying to navigate, what it actually means when they're developing the technology to be able to abide by these frameworks. But I really liked Ellie's, suggestion. I think that, what would be great to see is, pressure put on corporations around the way that their technologies are being applied, and I guess really just a light shone on how that works. And I think what I'd like to see in the future is actually that we have a lot more activists out there in the community who are testing these technologies and seeing whether they really do adhere to the values that we say we want for our society. And I think we've seen some recent examples of that. So if you have a look at the problems that happened recently in Washington, a whole host of members of the public actually very quickly started to use computer vision to identify some of the assailants, who were committing crimes on Capitol Hill. I think if we can harness that sort of community energy in the right direction, I think that that would actually be very helpful for a lot of technology companies who would like to be able to, test their technology thoroughly enough to know that it is meeting those ethical frameworks. I think rather than setting up, obviously it'd be great. We also need to have regulations in place to give us some guide rails, but to really test these things out, I think there's no I think there's no substitute for people actually putting these things to the test and then holding corporations to account.
So there's a bit of a theme that's coming here that I feel like there's a legal theme and there's a jurisdictional theme. So how does this abut regulation and different ways that different countries manage their own ways of being good or bad through their legal systems? Rupert, you work for a large multinational organisation that's absolutely trying to arbitrate different jurisdictional legal requirements. Are there any consistent themes, or is it a little bit like that story that Rata Sen told about the three flutes, where they said, I don't know if I'll segue and tell you the story of the three flutes if you haven't heard it. There's three children, sorry, no, it's not three flutes. Three children, one flute. One child says, I should have the flute because I have nothing. The second child says, I should have the flute because I play the flute. And the third child says, I should have the flute because I made the flute. And apparently different cultures actually answer the question of who should have the flute differently. So is there anything, Rupert, that you come across in IBM when you're trying to answer these questions of design, you're trying to answer these questions about what is actually an ethical framework differently at IBM?
I think I'm still thinking about the flutes, but I think obviously IBM is a really big company and does work in tons and tons of countries. I mean, the way we and any really, really big global company approaches things is probably pretty consistent, bar, a few nuances around certain countries. And I suppose you see some nuances around China, for example, at the moment. And China is perhaps in that grey area. There are some countries where we don't do business still, and we absolutely refuse to. But everything else we do, we set our own, to Sue's point, we set our own guardrails, and we do it so that we adhere to the kind of minimum criteria across the globe pretty much. At least that's the intent. So that then that's our way of stopping ourselves from falling foul of ethics. If we start to differentiate one country to another and create something in Australia that wouldn't be palatable or acceptable in New Zealand, then we'll definitely get ourselves in a real pickle. So I think, I guess the intent is there to the point about kind of good blockchain or good business. I think anybody that's trying to innovate with new tech in IBM's shoes, for example, the intent is there to do it with the right outcome. The question is, how do we govern ourselves, and how are we governed by others and guided by clients to make sure that it kind of meets the criteria? And of course, not going to meet every individual on the planet's criteria. That's a given. It's a massive spectrum of who thinks what's good. But that's probably how we approach it. So short answer, no, in the jurisdictions in which we operate, we don't see massive differences, or at least the differences we do see, we make sure we meet the minimum criteria probably.
So, I'll take it further with you, Rupert. So I'm coming from the perspective of being a lawyer and a technology lawyer. And one of this panel is supposed to be digital infrastructure and digital assets. Let's talk for a second about the trajectory of blockchain. What runs on a blockchain? Often it's a smart contract. And when a smart contract's being described by a lawyer, they're tending to mean that thing that people do to contract and have legal rights and obligations between people. Sometimes means something slightly different to technologists, might just mean code executing on a blockchain. But let's talk about legal contracts running on a blockchain. And that's a special class of asset. That's an asset that, we don't really want to get wrong in terms of its digitization journey, because obviously the law is pretty important. Access to justice is pretty important. So have you got any thoughts if there are any special requirements once we've moved into smart contracts moving around blockchains?
Yes, and I mean it's a domain I know you know an awful lot about, so I'll probably say the wrong thing. But
no, not at all.
I think Yes, absolutely. The kind of concept of an actual legal contract versus just a codified rule in some tech that's common across different people is again a bit of a fundamental, and probably, you know, it's probably one of the absolutely utopian use cases, because when you think about trying to programmatize, or whatever the verb would be, the good stuff, the good ethical things, the laws which have been made over a long period of time, how do you do it? Well, you plumb it into these solutions so people can't make errors, and so that everybody has to adhere to it. And then, you know, that will give rise absolutely to this challenge of how do you do that across jurisdictions. If you want to do things cross jurisdictions, you may well have something that's working just in Australia, working with just Australian law and within those guardrails. But what if you've built something that might get some benefit from, you know, traversing across to Singapore or whatever, wherever? You then have to bear in mind different legal frameworks. And I know there are going to be nuances there as well. So again, you kind of need to think about what is that underlying protocol-y type thing that enables you to plumb those different laws and policies and varying regulation into your system, so that everybody working on that system, you know, so that it works for them. It's a bit like, you know, one parallel I sometimes think of is the whole driving on the left, driving on the right side of the road. That is a sort of peculiar nuance that the world could probably do without, but it's adjusted to it by the fact that any car can drive on either side of the road. It's the car does the driving, you know, the guardrails there suffice, basically.
Yeah, that I'm not going to push you further down that track. I could speak for hours about it, but I'm not going to do that to you, Rupert, not today. Who wants to pick up a question? Because I am very interested, working in the Digital Law Association as well, very interested in the role of diverse teams in the design and production of digital transformation, digital technologies, and the blockchain community. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments that they'd like to make around particularly women being involved in the development of blockchain community?
I do.
Oh yes, go on, Rupert.
The controversial person to answer. I think, you know, I just think this is really basic. It's kind of like, it's almost like now in 2021, everyone's got this obsession about, let's think about customer experience or the end user experience, which is probably about 20 years late thinking about that. Similarly, I think designing, you know, good ethics, designing diverse applications designed by diverse people, and that whole kind of wave of diversity, that's how you get here. You know, that's how you get to a good thing, an effective thing that meets the needs of the people you're trying to do it for, is by having that diverse team. And it amazes me how many things are built by teams that aren't diverse for what is a diverse end user community. And then you, of course, you make errors and you don't really hit the nail on the head. So that's one of my kind of core principles. When I built my IBM team here in Australia, I made absolute sure, building from scratch, that I wasn't going to slip into a, you know, 80% male team, and it was 50-50, and I think it still is to this day. And you know, when you're building from the ground up in a new area like blockchain, whatever you're building, whether it's a new business or a, you know, the Queensland AI hub or whatever, you have that opportunity to get it right from the start, and that's the moment to do it, even if you build the team slower because of it or whatever.
Any other takers?
Oh, I don't disagree with any of that, but I would say that what is interesting about, one of the many things that's interesting about blockchain is that it's really not just about developers. You have whole communities of knowledge and expertise coming around to make a thing work. So in DeFi, it's very much about people with financial expertise. In NFTs, it's artists, and they're bringing, you know, creative and interesting work and contributions into these infrastructures that I think is, you know, often overlooked because we focus so much on who's making the code. And
but Ellie,
the code is nothing without the rest of it.
Are you saying that's, so you think it is a broader, much more balanced community when you take it out to those other stakeholders? Absolutely, and they're all over the world, and they are all genders and all the rest of it. That's not to say, I mean, absolutely some of these tech communities can be male dominated. The culture of them can also be quite exclusive, but there are, I think these communities are expanding as the infrastructures themselves enter into different parts of our lives.
And that's where diversity is going to come from if it's not just about who we hire. The other thing I would say, just to, I suppose, circle back a bit, is that although I'm often kind of going on about governance and communities, I do think that sometimes the best outcomes might be from things which do so-called ungovernance or try to minimize governance. So stable coins is something I'm interested in, and there's a lot of talk about how control theory can keep these coins stable and reduce the need for humans to be involved all the time. So I think when we're talking about ethics, it's not just about who's involved and how we're doing it, it's also about what outcomes they produce in the world. And sometimes, I mean, we have to accept the possibility that sometimes machines will do things better than us. Or
that's absolutely true.
More of the time too.
We already have that in the law, technology assisted review. It gets better results than humans. You actually have a legal duty to use it. Sue, what if we were all hands off and we say, okay, just let's let this thing, the crypto punks, the cipher punks were right. Let's just go forward and have as little regulation as possible, as fewer protocols on ethics as possible. What happens? What does the future look like?
Yeah, no, that's probably not a future I want to be a part of, because I've just been thinking about what Rupert was saying, and I think the big risk is that we will have a future that looks very much like that's populated by 18 to 30-year-old white Anglo-Saxon men who live on the west coast of the US and reflects only those points of view. In thinking about what Rupert was saying, I was thinking, wouldn't it be useful if we could use blockchain to actually record an immutable record of the diversity of technology teams associated with particular technology, so we can actually do a better job of tracking what the impact is when we don't have diverse teams tracking technology. I mean, we do have a lot of interesting examples, not so much from the blockchain AI space yet, on some of the pitfalls of not having diverse teams in the development of different technologies. We could be using these very technologies themselves to help to overcome that situation. So yeah, look, I'm not sure I really would feel very comfortable with the Wild West situation. I mean, on the one hand, I think that we're not actually providing, some of our technology creators with very practical suggestions on how they can adhere to a lot of these ethical frameworks. But yeah, I don't know. There has to be a balance there somewhere.
I have to agree. And I think that in some ways, ethics is a bit of a loose word, and the law can step up and we can have good governance that comes, which hopefully segues nicely into the start of our conference, where we had Senator Bragg saying that there is a responsibility for good government to make sure that our blockchain communities and technology itself is set up in the right way from the start. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions today, and I look forward to hearing more from all of you, and good luck. Keep fighting the good fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks.